My name is Oleg, and I want to tell you a story that forever changed the way I think about being home alone. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special about it. Little did I know that night would etch itself into my memory forever. My parents had gone to our country house, leaving me alone. The apartment was familiar, a two-room flat in an old five-story building where I had spent my entire childhood. At first, I was even excited no one to bother me about cleaning my room or going to bed early. I could just relax and play on my computer in peace. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Normally, I would play music or put on some background noise from YouTube to fill the silence, but that evening, for some reason, I wanted it quiet. I sat at my computer, eating chips and chatting with friends. Everything was as usual. It started around 10 p.m. I heard a creak. It wasn't loud, more of a faint, barely noticeable sound. I thought it must have been the neighbors. In old buildings like this, sounds carry through walls and floors. But a few minutes later, it happened again. The creak was quiet, but in the stillness of the apartment, it was impossible not to notice. I got up from my chair and walked into the hallway. The only light was coming from my room. The rest of the apartment was shrouded in shadow. I thought maybe it was the front door. It's old and sometimes sticks. I went over to check. Locked. Both locks and the chain were secure. Heading back to my room, I noticed the hallway closet door was slightly ajar. No big deal, I thought. I must have left it open when I grabbed my jacket this morning. I closed it and went back to my computer. About half an hour later, I heard another strange noise. This time it was louder, like someone lightly stepping on a creaky floorboard. It wasn't a neighbor, I was sure of that. The sound came from the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. Maybe it was a cat, but we've never had a cat. A mouse. Ridiculous, I'd never seen rodents in the apartment. But the feeling that I wasn't alone began to creep over me. I turned off my computer, letting the silence grow heavier. 10 minutes passed. No sounds. Everything was as usual. You're imagining things, I told myself. I went back to my desk and put on a movie to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. The feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. About 15 minutes into the movie, I noticed the hallway closet door was open again. Not just slightly ajar this time, halfway open. The hairs on my arm stood up. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Trying not to let fear show, I stood up and walked to the closet. Opening it, I expected to find something, maybe something had fallen or gotten stuck. But inside, everything was in perfect order. Jackets, the vacuum cleaner, some boxes. I closed the door and latched it to make sure it stayed shut. When I returned to my room, I realized I had left the hallway light on. Until that night, I thought I wasn't afraid of the dark. But now, the shadows in the hallway looked like something or someone was standing there, waiting. Around midnight, I heard a knock. It was a short, light sound, like something had fallen. Then another knock. I sat on the couch, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The kitchen. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and cautiously made my way there. The kitchen was empty. Everything was in its place, no plates or cups on the floor. I checked the windows shut tight, the frames sealed. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed one of the kitchen chairs was slightly out of place. Not much, just a couple of centimeters. I froze. I clearly remembered arranging the chairs neatly after dinner. Why would a chair move? I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had accidentally bumped it while walking. But the feeling that someone was there just out of sight became unbearable. I decided not to go to bed. I just waited out until morning and everything would feel normal again. Returning to my room, I plugged in my phone and put on headphones. It was quiet until I heard something crash onto the floor in the next room, my parents' bedroom. I jumped to my feet, but immediately realized I didn't want to go in there. Fear held me in place. Thoughts raced through my mind. Maybe I left a window open. Could someone have broken in? I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a metal flashlight from the table, and slowly made my way to the bedroom. The door was slightly open. I pushed it with my foot and turned on the light. No one was there. In the corner of the room, a small vase lay on the floor. It had been on the nightstand before. Maybe it fell because of a draft. But the windows were shut, and the door to the room had been closed. That's when I realized I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I quickly grabbed a few essentials, my phone, charger, and keys, and bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to turn off the lights. I ran downstairs and sat on a bench outside, waiting for morning to come. All I could think was it someone? Or am I just losing my mind? The next day I returned home with my parents. Everything was in its place. I never told them about the closet, the noises, or the chair that haunted my memory. But I never stay home alone anymore. My name is Artem, and I want to share a story that happened to me a little over a year ago. At first glance, it might seem ordinary, but it still haunts me whenever I recall it. An inexplicable fear takes hold of me. At the time, I lived in an old 5-story building on the outskirts of the city. A typical area with buildings from the 1970s, low ceilings, narrow hallways, peeling paint on the walls. Nothing remarkable. My apartment was just like everyone else's, a small kitchen, a room with a sofa and desk and a TV. The neighboring apartment, like most others, was usually vacant. Hardly anyone ever saw the neighbors in our building. Some rented out their units, others moved away and never returned. I worked remotely and spent most of my time at home. It was quiet, peaceful, and undistracted. That's why I noticed the sounds coming from the neighbor's door. It started close to midnight. I was sitting at my computer, editing documents. Suddenly, through the hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking clock, I heard a faint tapping. At first, I thought I imagined it. But the sounds grew clearer. Someone was knocking on the neighbor's door. I got up, approached my own door, and listened. The tapping continued, but there were no voices or footsteps. After about 5 minutes, the noise stopped. I figured someone must have knocked on the wrong door and went back to work. The next day passed uneventfully until night fell. At the same time, I heard the knocking again. This time, it was more persistent. I opened my door to see what was going on. The hallway was pitch dark. The bulb above the staircase had burned out long ago. The neighbor's door looked ordinary, peeling paint and an old mail slot. There was no one on the landing. I stood there for a minute listening, but heard nothing more. Feeling a bit uneasy, I went back inside and locked my door with both bolts. Over the next week, the knocking became a nightly ritual. Always at the same time. At first, I thought it was kids from another building playing pranks, but no matter when I peeked out, I never saw anyone. The knocking grew louder at times, turning into pounding. My annoyance turned into fear. I tried asking the neighbors downstairs if they had heard anything, but they just shrugged. "We haven't noticed anything." I told a friend about it, and he laughed, saying maybe I was going crazy from spending too much time alone. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to investigate. One afternoon, when the building was quiet, I went to the neighbor's door. I knocked and waited. Nothing. I tried the handle, it was locked. I even peeked through the keyhole, but couldn't see anything. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. The peephole on the neighbor's door was covered from the inside. A few days later, the knocking was accompanied by odd noises. Sometimes it sounded like muffled voices, other times like rustling. Most often I couldn't make out what it was. It started feeling like someone inside the apartment was doing this deliberately to draw attention. One night, I finally gathered my courage. When the banging started again, I opened my door and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I approached the neighbor's door to knock, but at that moment I heard a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. "Help me." I stumbled back, trying to process what I just heard. It was a clear plea for help. I shouted again, "Who's there? What's going on?" But there was no response. The next day I called the police. The dispatcher listened and asked, "Are you sure someone is inside the apartment?" I told them I'd heard a voice. They promised to send an officer, but no one ever came. I began to doubt myself. Was I imagining things, dreaming, or just losing my mind? Still, I started recording the sounds on my phone. Later, when I played them back, I thought I could hear faint footsteps and unclear noises, but it was all too indistinct. The final night was the worst. The knocking started around 2 a.m. this time. It was so loud I thought the neighbor's door might break down. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped into the hallway. The landing was empty, but the neighbor's door was slightly ajar. A faint light seeped through the crack. I froze. Something told me I shouldn't go in, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just bare walls and a strange, damp smell. That's when I noticed a dirty mattress on the floor. On it lay a phone, an old, basic mobile phone. Its screen was flashing as if it were receiving a call. I picked it up and heard my own voice. "Who's there? What's going on?" It was the recording I had made a few days earlier. I dropped the phone and bolted out of the apartment. The next morning, I moved out. I never found out what happened. Maybe it was a cruel prank, or maybe someone was watching me, playing with me. I tried telling my friends, but they just laughed, saying I was spending too much time alone. I don't know what was really going on in that apartment, but I'm certain of one thing. Someone wanted me to notice, and that's the scariest part of all. My name is Anton. I don't usually share this story. Few people believe me, and it's hard to think about even now. But maybe someone will see this as a warning. That night made me see the familiar in a whole new light. It happened a couple of years ago. My parents went to visit relatives in another city, leaving me alone at home. I was 22 at the time and confident I could handle anything. The apartment was familiar, cozy, and comforting. What could there possibly be to fear within four walls? The day went by as usual. Work on my laptop, cooking a simple dinner, and a couple of hours in front of the TV. By evening, the house had grown quiet, as it always did. Just the faint hum of cars outside and the occasional footsteps of neighbors behind the walls. Around 11, I decided to call it a night. I had an ordinary day ahead, nothing special. After undressing, I got into bed and reached for my phone to set the alarm when I heard a creak. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that could have gone unnoticed were it not for the absolute silence around me. The creak was brief, but so distinct that I couldn't ignore it. It came from the hallway. There were 3 doors in the apartment, and I knew one of them had a creaky hinge. Probably just a draft, I thought. But then I remembered. All the windows were closed and the balcony door was locked. I got up, turned on the hallway light, and looked around. Everything was in its place. I checked the front door. It was locked with both bolts. I shut my eyes and chuckled nervously. "You're overthinking things." I returned to bed, turned off the lights, and tried to dismiss the thought. 15 minutes later, the creak came again. This time it was clearer. Once more, I got up and checked the doors, walking through the entire apartment. Everything was silent, but as I turned to head back to my room, I noticed something odd. In the kitchen, where I always neatly push the chairs against the table, one chair was slightly out of place. Just a couple of centimeters, but it immediately unsettled me. I thought I might have bumped it earlier. I pushed it back, checked the windows again, and went to my room. As I lay down, a strange thought crept into my mind. What if someone was already in the apartment when I got home? I brushed it off, convincing myself it was paranoia, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I was on the verge of sleep when a sound sent shivers down my spine. Footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible, as though someone was trying not to make noise. They came from the kitchen. I jumped up, grabbing a heavy book from my desk, and cautiously made my way toward the sound. This time, I didn't even try to turn on the light. I was afraid sudden brightness might startle whoever or whatever was in the apartment. The kitchen was empty. Everything was in its place, but one of the cabinets was slightly ajar. I froze, holding my breath. I was certain I had closed it after dinner. That's when I felt real fear for the first time. I decided I wouldn't sleep that night. I plugged in my phone to charge and sat in the corner of my room, clutching the book. I turned on all the lights. Every tiny creak or rustle now felt significant. It was maddening. By 3 a.m., the noises seemed to grow more frequent. Barely perceptible sounds, rustling, faint taps. At one point, I thought I could hear breathing. I kept telling myself I might be losing it, but I couldn't shake the dread. I did another lap around the apartment, checking every corner, every cabinet. Nothing. But when I returned to my room, I noticed something that made my heart race. My bed had shifted slightly, just a few centimeters, but enough to be noticeable. As if someone had moved it, my pulse thundered in my ears. I realized I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. Grabbing my jacket and keys, I fled. Only after stepping outside did I feel a small measure of relief. I had no idea where to go, so I just started walking. The next morning, I came home with my parents. They didn't notice anything unusual. Everything was in its place. I told them about the noises, but they just laughed it off. Later, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just my nerves. But since that night, I've never stayed home alone again.